You're listening to Arutz Sheva Radio. Arutz Sheva Radio, your connection to Israel.
Hello and welcome to Life Lessons. This is Judy Simon on Israel National Radio. Today I am honored to host Mr. Bob Stark. Bob has been spending the last 35 years building up the largest and most respected real estate development company in Northeast Ohio called Stark Enterprises. But what interests me most is his numerous philanthropy activities, both Jewish philanthropy and philanthropy in Israel, including his involvement in the Fuchs Mizrahi School, in the Young Israel in Cleveland, of which he's vice president, and also the Torah Mitzion Kolalim, which he founded 15 years ago. And his Israel philanthropy includes the Safad Foundation, of which he is the founder, and his newest project, which is a medical school in Sfat, which is an incredible thing. Bob, I'm so glad that you joined us on the show today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me, Judy.
My pleasure, my pleasure. We always begin our show by talking about grandparents. Bob, I'm going to ask you to go back a few generations and tell me, who were your grandparents?
Well, you know, my grandparents on my father's side, my father was born and raised in Budapest, Hungary. But his parents, my grandmother, was from the part of Romania that is not far from Munkac, and my grandfather, who was from the area of, I guess it's Galicia, you know, in the Carpathian Mountains that were Hungarian, Polish, and my grandparents got married and moved to Budapest, and my father was born there.
Okay, so that's your dad's side.
My mother's side is very interesting, and recently I've become very familiar with it. It's a very distinguished family and has a remarkable history. My grandfather's name was Ben Stern, and my grandmother was Fanny Gottesman. And in the history of the Sterns and the Gottesmans, 3 times they intermarried with one another. So my great-great-great-grandparents, Stern married a Gottesman, and then my grandparents, Stern married a Gottesman, and then there was another Stern who married a Gottesman who gave birth to Jerome Stern, who is a big Baal Tzedakah in New York City. But the Gottesman side is very involved historically with the state of Israel. Mendel Gottesman was a big philanthropist in New York and related to Yeshiva University. Milton Gottesman was the Jew who bought the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Arab who found them. And his daughter built the Shrine of the Book to house the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sandy Gottesman is now very involved in building an aquarium and doing something else of major civic significance in Jerusalem. Another Gottesman, the son of a Gottesman, was the founder of Slim Fast and is also very involved in the state of Israel. And it seems that on both sides of my family, whether it was my father's side or my mother's side, all of my ancestors were not rabbis, which always made me jealous of all my friends who had a...
Well, Bob, you have nothing to be ashamed of. You come from a rich and respectable family of, as you said, Balei Tzedakah, people that are philanthropists.
And Sionim.
And you're following in their footsteps.
And Sionim. I mean, you know, even my mother's father was one of those people who bought land in Israel in the 1920s, and all of the Sterns and the Gottesmans were Sioni from generations back, and very successful business people, and very extraordinary Balei Tzedakah. And that seems to be my heritage from both sides of my family.
It's in the genes. It's in the genes. So with your father, we left off that he was born in Hungary. When did he come to the States?
He came to the States the year before the Nazis invaded Hungary. It was very fortuitous. I mean, in addition to what was going on in Europe, he mainly wanted to come at age, I think he was 17 or so, and he wanted, his wanderlust brought him or directed him to come to the United States to make a new life for himself.
And really save his life.
it really saved his life, and furthermore, it saved the life of my grandparents because he was very close to my grandparents, and the first summer that he was living in Cleveland, Ohio, his parents decided to come and visit, and it was that summer that the Nazis invaded Hungary, so my grandparents never went back, and they were saved because of it.
Incredible, incredible. And how did your father meet your mother?
Actually, I don't know how they met, but they lived in what was, the main Jewish neighborhood of the time in Cleveland, and I don't remember the story about how they met per se.
So tell me about the home that your parents created for your family in Cleveland.
Well, my childhood was it was very similar to a lot of people who grew up in the 50s in America. It was, even though, the United States was dealing with things like the Korean War, it was a post-war era, post-World War II, post-Korean War for the most part, that I grew up in, and it was a quiet time of building and of suburban sprawl, and everybody, the American dream of the car and the drive and your own independent single-family home and your own lawn and yard, and things were pretty simple and straightforward and wholesome in a certain sense during that time period. My father was trying to make a living and was interested, first of all, because like many immigrants, he and his parents started a Hungarian restaurant in Cleveland. They had 2 Hungarian restaurants. Then my father saw everybody involved in the post-war boom of housing, which must have been a lot like what's going on in Israel today. Everywhere you look, there was construction going on and young families needing housing. And he then got into the lumber business to supply to these contractors, and then he decided to build housing himself. So he built a lot of those homes that I think there was a song written about, Ticky Tacky or something, about the types of houses all in a row that were built exactly the same and as though they were on a production line. And many people lived in those houses, winding up expanding them up and sideways and all around. So my father built those, and later on he progressed to some of the earlier commercial retail development that happened at those times outside of the center city in the suburbs. And unfortunately, then he passed away when I was only 13 years old.
Oh.
My mother's response to his death, which didn't make any sense at the time because my family was not religious, particularly religious, although I guess you would say we had strong connections, but something came out of my mother that told her to send me that summer that my father passed away on a trip to Israel, on a bar mitzvah pilgrimage out of New York to Israel for 6 weeks. So I found myself, within weeks of my father's passing, on an airplane, going to Israel and experiencing for the first time in my life saying Kaddish on an airplane.
Wow, what a heavy summer that must have been for you. So many experiences, both very, very horrible and also, I expect, good experiences in Israel.
Well, it was, I think that trip at that time was foundational to, who I became, who I've become later. After that trip, I was never the same in terms of my feelings about Israel and what place it held in my personality and in my sense of purposefulness and in my heart and emotionally.
Tell us about that summer in Israel. What did you do during that time? What did you see? What did you feel?
Well, the base camp, so to speak, was a moshav called Alonei Yitzchak. I remember the post address was Dorna Shomron, and I don't really know where that is, and I should visit because it was so meaningful to me. There are a couple of highlights. One is that in the first day that we were gathered there, mostly kids from New York and a couple of kids from Cleveland, were sitting on the lawn and they gave us those funky, whatever the name of those Israeli hats were the
Kova Temple.
That's right. We're all wearing that, and we're wearing shorts. And at the time, I think Madras shorts were popular, and shirts, looking like little Americans sitting on the lawn. And the guy who ran the program was a really radical rabbi from South Africa, a Jabotinskyite. And the first thing he did was he confronted these American kids with the question, what would you do if the United States were to attack Israel? What would you do?
He was forcing you to choose a loyalty, really.
Yeah, right between the eyes. And and all these kids were kind of like deer in the headlights. And one kid jumped up immediately and said, and what would you do if you were in the Israeli Air Force and you were told to bomb New York City and the area surrounding it where there are 3 million Jews? And he looked at that.
He turned the question around, huh?
That's right. Well, that was me.
That was you.
That was me. That was the beginning. That kind of describes who I am, and that was the beginning of a wonderful mentoring relationship between him and me during that year. He was, of course, aware that I had just lost my father, and it was a remarkable learning experience. I remember standing, now this was 1964, so I remember standing with my fingers through a fence with barbed wire on the top and looking between what was New Jerusalem at that time under the control of Israel, and then the other side, whichever viewpoint it was Jordan. And the line of the fence was the line between green and white. Everything on my side of the fence was green, and everything on the other side of the fence was parched, barren, white, bleached, blanched, lavan. And
because nobody was caring for the flora and the agriculture, or was it something else?
Well, I immediately, related to it, spiritually, even though I wasn't raised that way. I'm about tshuva, and that happened many years later after I got married. So I immediately felt the fact that the Jewish people had returned to their home and then the land had blossomed because of it, for whatever practical reason, and that the other side of the fence was barren, because it didn't have us as part of its context. So, that's how I was struck by it. And standing there, looking over into Yerushalayim, Ir Atikah, which you couldn't see very well at all. I remember, even though I had no real spiritual, religious background, I remember praying to God and saying, in effect, please, please, please soon let us go on the other side. Let us be where we belong. And 3 years later, I was convinced that God had answered my prayer.
For sure.
Directly.
You make it sound as though he didn't. He did answer.
No, directly. 3 years later, he answered my prayer. And in 1967, we were on the other side. And then I remember another incident that stands out in my memory. The closest you could get to the old city at that point was on the roof of Notre Dame, if you know where it is. And the building was divided in half. Half of it was in Jordan, and half of it was in Israel. And on the roof, there was barbed wire that divided the roof in half. And on the far end of the other end of the roof, there were Jordanian guys behind sandbags with machine guns. So my mother had given me this what we would now call ancient movie camera, and it was hanging around my neck. And I started to pan the horizon of the old city, and all of a sudden I hear all kinds of people yelling, screaming, and I just instinctively dropped the camera, which didn't crash because it was around my neck. And I looked around, and somebody came over to me, and he pointed to a Jordanian soldier who had swiveled his machine gun and was pointing it right at me.
Oh, my God.
Because I was taking pictures. And
you must
I
have
was
been an
told,
enemy spy.
I must have been. After all, I was all of 13, almost 14 years old. And, they told me that a week or two prior, they had shot somebody for taking pictures. So, that describes, kind of the emotional foundation of being on the outside looking in, which, by the way, I still experience even more dramatically when I'm subjected to the kind of treatment that we're given when you go up on Har Habayit today.
On Temple Mount, yes. And I hope that you still have that same prayer in your heart, because clearly God answered your prayer then, so hopefully He'll answer it again now.
Yeah, I really need to work on that and focus back on that, because it was so... my prayer was so powerful then that, you never know. So I'm going to, take that under advisement and really work on it. Okay.
Bob, when you got back to the States after that very intense summer, how were you a different person than you had been?
Well, the bottom line is I realized that in order to be a whole Jew spiritually, or in terms of my identity, which is what I wanted to be, for the first time, first of all, the level of awareness, self-awareness, self-Jewishness was so strong that I realized it was not avocational, that it was not just about some religion like the other religions in the United States, that I was part of an unbelievable nation, and that sense of nationality was inseparable, and the people and the land were inseparable from my understanding of what being Jewish was. And that was a brand new feeling, and unfortunately that's something that's missing in most of Galut, and unfortunately even in many of the people who live in Israel today, which sounds impossible, but that is true.
There's a separation that you're saying is unnatural.
Well, exile relegated being Jewish. I'm an advocate of us changing that and just calling all of us either Hebrews or Israelis, because I think Judaism is too often confused with Christianity and Islam and Buddhism as a belief system, as a religion per se. And we're a religio nation, which is a totally unique concept. We're a nation of people in a particular land that was divinely given to us with a mission, as our central focus for the people in its land that benefits the entire world. And there's nothing else that comes close to that. And the beginnings of my first understanding of that mission and who we are and who I am relative to that started on that trip.
Now, Bob, you mentioned that you became about tshuva when you got married. Do you want to tell us a little about that process?
Yeah, so pretty much all of that experience from, age 13 then was incorporated, but was dormant for a while because, the culture of the United States is pretty powerful. So as a person growing up and headed towards college and all the usual American kind of things that you do, and if you're not raised in a religious home and you don't have any relationship to the holidays or to Shabbat, it's easy to be a secondary thing or not to be part of your life at all. But it had already been planted inside of me, and it was consistent with something else, or maybe the something else that I thought that it was always this. I always described myself as a truth seeker. I was always concerned about the existential question. Why am I here? What is my purpose in life? I must have been awfully boring. I really wasn't, but I don't think I was. People say I'm very intense, and I think I'm funny. But so maybe my lens paradigm is all screwed up. But in any case, no matter what I was doing, my approach to things was always about to what end? To what end? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Nothing to me was ever frivolous. And thinking back on it, this was my Jewish, national, religious, spiritual, mission-oriented self asking this question in code, in language that I understood then, truth-seeking, purposefulness, what's it all about? And that went on and was important even in terms of who I married. If I couldn't marry somebody who had, at least that degree of self-examination as part of their construct, then that would be the wrong person for me. So when I was blessed to find that person, she and I very quickly sought out a way to engage more deeply in those questions and how they affected our lives. And fortunately, we turned to our own heritage instead of Hare Krishna or Jews for Jesus or run off to India and enter some ashram or any of those other things. We said, well, wait a second. There's this rich heritage that we're a part of. We better first see whether or not it's there. Mm-hmm. And then we got lucky. We met a rabbi who, way before the kind of Baal Tshuva organizations that exist today, was doing outreach work, and the most important part of that was education, was familiarizing us with texts. And when a truth seeker digs into texts, that's when things begin to change.
So you and your wife went on your spiritual journey together, and thank God you were looking in the right place, so you found the truth. Yeah,
it was a combination of mazel and bracha, and that process.
Best combination.
It's the best combination, and believe me, we're very well aware of it because it's a rarity, and it changed our life in such a significantly positive, beyond comprehension and beyond articulation way, and we're so grateful. Our gratitude for that opportunity is overflowing.
And that leads to philanthropy, which we're going to talk about. But we're at the end of the first half of the show, so stay tuned in. We're going to hear more about Bob Stark's journey and how he got into his philanthropy from the spiritual journey. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
This is Avram Puro from Houston, Texas, here on vacation in Eretz Yisrael with my wife Hetty, and we are broadcasting right now from Arut Sheva, IsraelNationalRadio.com, and it is amazing what these people have accomplished here. All of you who listen to Arut Sheva on a regular basis, I can tell you that it really deserves our respect. You are listening to IsraelNationalRadio.com.
When you look into his eyes, you can see for centuries. In touch with all I can and cannot see. Etched into his forehead, the passages of time. He's a spiritual man. Wanted to meet him and have him lead the way. He'd take us to the place where we should be. I know that they are out there. I've met just 2 or 3, standing up for all that's good, wanting what's best for me. When you look into his eyes, you can see for centuries. In touch with all I can and cannot see. The pages from the sage the pages from the sages, the knowledge pouring through. I'm a spiritual man. We are spiritual man.
We're back with the second half of Life Lessons. This is Judy Simon on Israel National Radio, and we're in the middle of a conversation with Bob Stark, who is a real estate genius and a genius when it comes to knowing how to lead one's life. A life of tzedakah, of philanthropy, of good deeds, of being a good person. And that's what I'd like to ask you about, Bob. How did you start your journey of being a Baal Tzedakah, a philanthropist?
Well, first of all, I have to correct something. You know, I'm very self-conscious when you refer to me as a genius. I'm just trying to be a shaliach, okay?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I looked up a list of the companies that you developed or managed, and it's a good 4 pages long, and I'm sure it's a partial list. So you're not doing too poorly in that department. You have nothing to be ashamed of.
Okay, well, just as a life lesson, that what you observed is called process. It looks like genius, maybe, when you work process all of the time, which I believe, by the way, is the way that you emulate, the divine. The divine is infinite, and it's never ending. And the thing that we can do as finite beings that simulates that is to work process and to be here in the moment, and working process is what we are capable of doing. The results, which sometimes are referred to as visionary or aspects of genius, are things that are provided to us as a consequence of working that process, and only one force in the universe does that, and that's what we believe to be the master of the universe. So that's just a side issue that happens to be also the most important issue in our lives. So in any case, going back to philanthropy, it's interesting because I never connected the dots per se on this, but that experience that I had as a bar mitzvah boy in Israel, in the wake of my father's passing, also created an urge within me to be what I described at that time. As a matter of fact, I described it to a young girl who was the daughter of my mother's childhood friend. My mother is Harriet Stark, and her friend Faye Comet had 3 daughters, and my mother had 3 sons. And my mother was in Faye Comet's wedding as, one of the bridesmaids. And they used to kid about the fact that she had 3 daughters, and my mother had 3 sons, and maybe there would be a shidduch there. Now, I didn't know that Faye Comet always took a liking to me until one summer when I was home from college, and I'm at that point 19, 20 years old, and she happened to be visiting my mother, and she said, Marla is in town. Now, Marla was 4 years younger than me, and I thought of her as a baby, and never thought of her in any other way. So Faye Comet finagled some way to get Marla to come over with her, and I'm standing in the driveway. I can picture the whole thing. I was washing my car. I was a football player, and here comes this girl that I knew as a little girl. There's a big gap. 4 years at that point is a big gap. So one of the things I said to her post-Israel experience, I knew that I wanted to contribute to my people in connection with the religious, spiritual, and Zionistic emotions I was experiencing in being part of rebuilding our land. And I created a term for myself because this little girl said to me, "Hey, what do you want to do? What are you studying? What do you think you want to do?" And my response, which must have been very nerdy, was, "I want to be a creative philanthropist." Well, a creative philanthropist, what the heck does that mean? A creative philanthropist. By the way, today I call myself the poet developer, so I'm still as nutty as I've always been. Well, meanwhile, this girl was so taken with this guy who said, creative philanthropist. You know, I couldn't have said something more charming in her eyes. So, and it wasn't till years later where she could act upon that. So really, that Israel experience was the foundation of my feelings about philanthropy, and more particularly geared towards what I could contribute in terms of my efforts and otherwise to the well-being and the progress of my people.
Now, you mentioned earlier in the show that when you came back from Israel, one of your guiding forces was being an influence, making the world a better place, finding some way to bring goodness to the world in any way that you can. So you went to study what in college? English
literature. And when people say, well, why? And my response was, if you put the kind of genius that, now we're going to use genius, the kind of genius that Shakespeare or Milton or Chaucer had inside of your head, so some of it's got to rub off.
So really this was part of your plan. You were trying to be influenced by the literary greats.
Yes, no question about it. It was deliberate. It was deliberate for that as a character builder. You know, again, if I had been from a different orientation, it would have been to learn Talmud for the same reason. When you learn Gemara, when you learn Tanakh, it's not just for what you understand is going on, it's so that you learn how to think, how to analyze, how to articulate, a command of the spoken word and the written word. You know, one of the things I pride myself in is being quite a wordsmith. And the power of the pen or of your ability to be articulate is more powerful than anything else.
I want to talk to you now about some of your philanthropic projects. Which one would you like to begin with? There are so many.
I would like to begin with, I think, the Fuchs Mizrahi School. It's really more than that. It's the whole effort to change a modern Orthodox community in the shadow of Telshe Yeshiva and the Haredi mainstream in Cleveland, Ohio, into Mamash, a Dati Leumi school-based community.
Dati Leumi meaning national religious.
A national religious or religious Zionist community, and to differentiate that from modern Orthodox with the agenda of training leaders who are grounded in this identity of Jewish self that is inseparable from Medinat Yisrael and the God of Israel, and to hope that the effect is so profound that they make Aliyah. A springboard.
Well, that's a very big goal for a young guy.
Yeah, it's a big goal, and it's nearly impossible. But I'm not looking at the goals. You became goal-oriented immediately. That was your comment. I'm Professor Process. So when you're working process, you don't have to worry about the goal. If your kavanah, if your intent and your will is directed in a pure way to accomplish something important, then you don't have to worry about how big things are. You just work it.
You just keep making progress.
Yeah, you represent. You're a shaliach. You're a conduit. And you let the energy and the power, the efficacy flow through you because you're engaging it. So the concept was 4 prongs, a total immersion model. One was a school that was unlike any other school, and that school is Fuchs Mizrahi School, which is dedicated to leadership training and religious Zionist ideals, morals, and religious orientation. Lifestyle, worldview, okay? And the Fuchs Mizrahi School, miraculously, is that place. I remember building the new facility and sizing it to 500 kids. Now remember, we're talking about Cleveland, Ohio. Remember when we had, maybe just under 300 kids, and I remember laughing, saying, this will never happen. Well, this year, 2014, Fuchs Mizrahi School exceeded 500 kids, and that's after, over the years, 25 years that it's been in existence, sending hundreds of families and kids on Aliyah in total disproportion to any community in the Golah. Okay?
Wow.
So that's one prong, but that's not enough. Okay? The mission led to the creation of the first, what we called Torat Zion Kollel, which was really founded not just to bring a certain kind of learning, in our case, the Torah Eretz Yisrael, the Torah that is affected and informed by living the dream after our return to our land and activating all of these things that the Torah is about in real time. Not only about learning that, but more importantly, about role modeling. And by that I mean, for the first time in America, we imported a Rosh Kollel and Avrechim and their families, who had served in the Israeli army, who were Talmidei Chachamim mostly from the Gush, from Har Etzion, and Har Etzion was the first yeshiva in Israel to participate in this crazy idea and to give up some of their most prized teachers to come and spend a year or 2 or 3 as a Rosh Kollel in a community and become, the role model of the type of Jew that we were creating. Because it's one thing to teach, it's another thing to observe. And observing, the picture being worth 1,000 words is even more true when it's not a picture and it's a human being, or better than that, it's a couple with a family, and you watch how they behave, and it had never been done. And Kollel, to the modern Orthodox community, was associated only with a certain type of learning in the Haredi community. So being about Tshuva, not knowing any better, I called it a Kollel, and I called it Torat Zion because I felt that the fulfillment of the prophecy of Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah had always been misunderstood, that we all understood it as one day when the Geula comes and we return to Zion, that the Torah from Muncie and the Torah from Cleveland and the Torah from Paris and the Torah from you name it, the Torah of Galus, instead of coming from those places, would come out of Yerushalayim. But then I realized that's not what it meant at all. It meant that when we were returned to Zion, that Torat Zion, the applied Torah that comes out of the land of Israel, from the holy dirt of the land, would now, this new Torah would go out to the rest of the world and inform it in real terms, in new terms, Shir Chadash, okay? New terms, what we are and what we represent and what our mission is. The role modeling aspect was more important than anything else. Obviously the learning and the type of learning was, right behind it, was what gave rise to the first Torat Zion Kollel, by the way, and that's why I called it Torat Zion, like Torat Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah. Bob, you were not only redefining the word Kollel, which you said you did. It was no longer the Kollel of old. You were also redefining the community in which you were raised, in which you grew up. You were changing it by bringing in people that were role models. You were infusing the Cleveland community with Torat Zion, as you called your Kollel. Incredible.
Oh, yeah, and what's even more incredible is it then became the Torah Mitzion Kollel movement that affected tens of other communities throughout the world. I mean, it was bizarre. How it just caught fire and then spread and affected so many communities and probably created a tremendous amount of aliyah. So, yeah, it was a privilege to be able to channel that idea in. So we had the school and the Torat Zion Kollel. The other very, 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 very critical component was the informal education provided by the camp that was supported by the Cleveland community and my business partners, by the way, the Weiss Stone family, which is Camp Stone in upstate New York, which is the most remarkable Dati Tzioni camp in the world. And in combination with these other things, was just like the cherry on top. Along with that, in lockstep with that, was the fact that we innovated something else. We took B'nai Akiva, which had previously been run only by kids in America. That was kind of their mantra, but it wasn't real successful, and it was paling in comparison to the adult-supervised NCSY, which had a different identity. It was OU-based. It was really more of a black hat organization reaching out to public school kids who had no Jewish relationship. And B'nai Akiva was us, but had no structure. So what we did was, I spoke to the Sachnut, and we got their cooperation in sending a shaliach, an adult shaliach, to Cleveland to organize all of the B'nai Akivas in the Midwest, in Detroit, in Toronto, in Cleveland, in Columbus, in Buffalo. And then what we did was we created interaction between all of those groups, which in itself was a big attraction. And B'nai Akiva all of a sudden took off. Well, that dovetailed perfectly with Camp Stone, because Camp Stone is a B'nai Akiva,
right,
moshava. And that blew up in a positive way, and expanded like crazy. And today you're lucky if you can get a kid into Camp Stone, and they come from all over the United States
wow,
and Israel to go to Camp Stone. The last component is a new type of religious center, a spiritual center that takes all of this and doesn't just place it into a conventional shul with a sanctuary and a place to have weddings and bar mitzvahs, but that is organized in a way to deal with all of the lifestyle aspects and the cultural aspects and the spiritual aspects of the kind of Jewish life that we're talking about. And we are finally in direct process of converting one of the existing synagogues, the Green Road Synagogue, into that type of place, because now with this 500 kids in the school and the community has grown so dramatically, there's the critical mass to make that happen. And that's the last component part of the immersive model.
What I love about what you're describing, Bob, is that it's a holistic system. Like you had said at the beginning of the show, Judaism is not just a faith. There's something that runs much deeper in it. And your system of tapping into Judaism is just as deep. You're doing it from all sides, all panels, all angles, which is incredible.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Now, you're a giver, but not only do you give to the people, you also remember to give thanks to God. Your song, which you chose for me to play, is a song that's sung by Yehuda Katz, but if I'm not mistaken, it's a song that you yourself wrote, and it's called Hodu, which means thanks. You want to tell us a little bit about that song?
Well, you're right. All of this activity, unless you're blind, leads to a tremendous sense of gratitude. I mean, being a real estate developer and working it as a process and recognizing how many variables there are that can make something happen or make it not happen, that can make it successful or make it a disaster, is very consistent with my life's course. And all of these other things that we've described result in gratitude. I have a theory that at the end of time, at the end of days, that the only thing that will separate the creator from the created, God from mankind, is hoda'ah, is gratitude. Because in that ultimate sense of awareness, the only response we can have is Hodu. And this song, really the lyrics were written by King David. If you want to refer to them, they're in Psalm 30, that's Lamed, something we say every day in Tefillah, and the lines are taken from, so King David is the lyricist, and I was the composer of the music, and Yehuda Katz is the remarkable performer. I wrote it because Kapitel Lamed became very important to me when I found out I had cancer.
Mm.
Well, I think it's, it's another aspect of how you develop a sense of gratitude.
When you're faced with challenges.
That's right.
Okay. So let's listen to the song Hodu, written originally by King David, put into melody by Bob Stark, and performed by Yehuda Katz.
Hodu, lezecher kodsho, vehodu, lezecher kodsho, Hodu. לזכר קודשו והודו לזכר קודשו מה יזמר לך כבוד יזמר לך כבוד ולא ידור מה יזמר לך כבוד יזמר לך כבוד ולא ידור שיבתי אל
להערי עוז, הסתרת פניך, הייתי נבהל. למען יזמר לך כבוד, יזמר לך כבוד, ולא ידור. למען יזמר לך כבוד, יזמר לך כבוד, ולא ידור. והודו לזכר קודשו, והודו לזכר קודשו, והודו לזכר קודשו, והודו לזכר קודשו.
Incredible. Wow. You know, I love that song. Bob, we've come to the end of our show, and we always end by asking, what lessons have you learned on your own personal life journey that you'd like to share with the rest of us?
10 years ago, my life was turned upside down because I was diagnosed with parotid cancer. The parotid gland is right behind your ear. It's a rare form of cancer, and unfortunately, it was stage 4, which is not good news. Baruch Hashem, I just reached my 10 years mark out from the
It's like a new birthday.
That's right. Well, it certainly is. But having experienced a profound sense of depression that resulted from, it was post-surgical, and it was about the whole circumstance. And my father had passed away from cancer, so I was replaying all kinds of mental things in my own head related to that. And having seen that place, unfortunately, that some people never climb out of, and is why they take their lives, because there's no sense of hope. Everything is bleak, and you can't stay there very long. Well, when I emerged from that, I only emerged from it because, in part, I was getting very close to Tehillim. King David, all over Tehillim, deals with this issue. The relationship between deliverance and the lowest points of existence, and the reason that we as individuals and as a people, and there's the Shoah and things that have happened recently and throughout the history of the Jewish people, that the overarching reason or seeming reason for why these things happen to individuals and to nations and to a people is because when you are fortunate enough to survive and be redeemed, you have an overwhelming sense of gratitude. And that changes your lens paradigm on everything in existence and puts you firmly in the moment. I like to say that the past is a function of our memory, and the future is a creation of our imagination, but the present is God's space.
The past is a function of our memory. The future is a function of our imagination. And the present is God's face.
God's. Zeh hayom asa Hashem nagila v'nismecha vo. Why does it say this?
This is
the day that God created?
We should be joyful and celebrate today.
Yeah, so why does it have to say this? It's superfluous. That zeh is the moment. This moment, zeh hayom. Hayom is a euphemism for the moment. Asa Hashem is God's creation, not your past that you create or your future that you imagine. And what you have to do in this moment, from a sense of immense gratitude, is nagila v'nismecha vo. Be joyful and joyous and celebrate every moment, and that means do your job, be part of the team, work the process, and represent your people, your land, and your God.
Beautiful. Wow. Wow. That is so powerful. Bob, thank you so much for sharing your life story with us, and more importantly, for sharing your message and for sharing all the things that you share with us. You share yourself, really, on a daily basis, and for that I thank you.
It's my privilege. You don't have to thank me. I'm privileged to be able to do whatever I can.
God should continue to give you good health and good strength and the wisdom
Amen.
to continue to be the creative philanthropist or the poetic giver that you have become. And it should all be good for you, for all of us, for Am Yisrael.
Thank you. Thank you. Amen. Amen.
And thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. Have a wonderful, wonderful week and a good Chodesh Elul, a month of reconnecting with your inner self, with your soul, reconnecting with God, and becoming a little bit more like Bob Stark.